19 enemy warships were closing in on the station. There were 317 civilians trapped inside its crystalline hull. 62 of them were children. Deep space sensors indicated that the nearest Dominion reinforcement fleet was exactly 47 minutes away. In the cold, unforgiving mathematics of interstellar warfare, the station would be reduced to a cloud of radioactive vapor in less than 10. There was no hope. There was no rescue. The predators of the abyss had come to claim their prey. Or so they thought, because hovering between the overwhelming pirate armada and the fragile walls of the alien space station was a single battered, impossibly archaic vessel. It was forged not from elegant energy fields or sleek synthetic alloys, but from thick, heavy slabs of cold titanium and dense tungsten armor. It bled heat. It spat chemical exhaust. It had no business being in this quadrant of the galaxy, let alone standing in the path of certain death. But it did not move. It did not retreat. To understand how a solitary human warship came to stand against the dark, we must step back. Exactly 15 minutes earlier, before the fire, before the sacrifice, before the galaxy learned what it truly meant to cross a human being. The emergency alarms aboard the Galactic Dominion Border Station Prime screamed with a synchronized pulsing crimson light. For 300 standard cycles, Commander Valen had overseen this lonely outpost at the absolute edge of civilized space. For 300 cycles, nothing had happened. The boundary was a sacred line established by an empire of 10,000 united worlds. It was marked by warning beacons that broadcast a simple, undeniable truth in every known language across the cosmos. Cross this line and face the wrath of gods. Valen's 4 eyes snapped open. He rose from his command platform, his massive armored frame casting a long shadow across the polished deck. He belonged to a species engineered for authority. He was the law in this sector, the iron fist of a civilization that had conquered the stars while other races were still striking flint to make fire. His communications officer, a being composed of faceted minerals, turned from the sensor array. The officer was trembling. "Commander, we have an unidentified vessel. It crossed the boundary marker 7 minutes ago." Valen's voice was like grinding tectonic plates. "Have they ignored the warning broadcasts?" "Completely, Commander. They are maintaining a steady trajectory directly into our space. They are not decelerating." Valen stepped up to the primary viewing sphere. "Show me." The image flickered into existence, and for a moment the veteran Dominion commander simply stared. It was a ship, but unlike anything he had ever seen. By Dominion standards, it was an atrocity of engineering. It lacked the seamless organic curves of advanced starcraft. It was blocky, utilitarian. An ugly brutalist wedge of welded plating propelled by the violent thrust of chemical rockets. It left a dirty trail of ionized particles in its wake. It was a machine built by a species that did not glide through the stars, but fought their way into them, clawing against gravity through sheer stubborn force. Analysis, Valen demanded. The station's artificial intelligence responded with a tone of mechanical disdain. Vessel classification unknown. Technology level primitive. Power signatures suggest nuclear fission. Weapons detected kinetic projectile systems. Threat level to Dominion forces, absolute zero. Valen felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. This was a fledgling race. A young, arrogant species that had just discovered the secrets of faster-than-light travel and immediately rushed out into the black, entirely ignorant of the apex predators that waited in the deep. "Open a channel," Valen ordered, drawing himself up to his full imposing height. "All frequencies. Let us educate these trespassers before they force me to turn them into dust." The transmission array locked onto the primitive vessel. Valen stared into the visual pickup, letting his natural intimidation fill the frame. "Unidentified vessel. This is Commander Valen of the Galactic Dominion. You have violated sacred territory. You are surrounded by weapons capable of stripping the atoms from your hull. You have exactly 30 seconds to reverse your course. Return to your system of origin. Never return. Failure to comply will result in your immediate and total destruction." The threat was absolute. It was backed by the weight of 10,000 worlds. Any sane creature would immediately cut their engines, beg for mercy, and flee. Valen watched the countdown timer on his console. 30 seconds, 20 seconds, 10 seconds. The alien ship did not slow down. It did not change course. It just kept coming. Valen narrowed his eyes. He prepared to order a warning shot across their bow. Then the comms panel chirped. The trespassers were answering. The visual feed clicked on, cutting through a thick layer of static. The bridge of the alien vessel was a stark contrast to the elegant, sterile command center of the Dominion station. It was cramped. The lighting was harsh, casting deep shadows over consoles crowded with physical buttons, analog dials, and heavy switches. The air inside the cabin looked thick, smelling almost perceptibly of ozone-recycled oxygen and sweat. Sitting in the center chair was a bipedal creature. He was of moderate build, wearing a dark blue uniform that looked worn at the edges. His face was lined with deep creases, the kind earned from a lifetime of looking out into the unforgiving abyss. His hair was touched with gray at the temples. This was Captain Silas Thorne of the United States Space Command. He did not look terrified. He did not look intimidated. In his right hand, he held a heavy ceramic mug. Steam curled from the dark liquid inside. He took a slow, deliberate sip, swallowed, and set the mug down on the metal console with a soft clack. "Well, howdy there," Thorne said. The translation matrix worked furiously to convert the casual deep baritone into standard galactic speech. "This is Captain Silas Thorne of the USS Vanguard. We received your message loud and clear, Commander. But I think there's been a bit of a misunderstanding." Valen was momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of the creature. "A misunderstanding? You are trespassing in sovereign Dominion space. You will turn back, or you will die." Thorne offered a slight, lopsided smile. It was not a gesture of submission. It was the smile of a man who had stared down a hurricane and refused to blink. "You see, Commander, we checked our star charts before we left home. As far as Earth is concerned, this is open space. Freedom of navigation. We aren't looking to start any trouble. We aren't claiming any rocks. And we aren't pointing our guns at you. We're just passing through on our way to map a thermal anomaly a few light years out. Beautiful sector you've got here, by the way." Valen's primary hearts began to beat faster. This human was speaking to him as if they were neighbors chatting across a fence. He was facing down a station armed with particle beam cannons, and he was complimenting the scenery. Captain Thorne, Valen growled, leaning closer to the screen. "Your charts are irrelevant. Our warning beacons have marked this territory for millennia." "Oh, the beacons," Thorne nodded, tapping a thick finger against his jaw. "Yeah, we picked up those signals a couple of days ago. Fascinating encryption you guys use. Our computers chewed on it for hours, couldn't make heads or tails of it. So I figured the polite thing to do was just knock on the front door and introduce ourselves." Valen's officer whispered urgently from the side, "Commander, they truly did not understand the beacons. Their technology is too primitive to decrypt quantum-locked signals." Valen ignored the officer. Ignorance was not an excuse. But what unsettled him deeply was the utter lack of fear in the human's eyes. "Let me make this perfectly clear," Captain Valen said, his voice dropping to a dangerous vibrating frequency. "I am not requesting your compliance. I am demanding it. I will demonstrate the consequence of your defiance. Perhaps your species requires a visual lesson." Valen signaled his weapons officer. "Target the asteroid cluster in Grid 7. Maximum yield. Fire." Outside the station, massive orbital cannons shifted silently in the vacuum of space. They drew power directly from the station's core, glowing with a terrible, blinding blue light. A fraction of a second later, a concentrated beam of accelerated particles lashed out into the dark. It struck a cluster of 30 massive iron-rich asteroids floating 3,000 kilometers away. The rocks simply ceased to exist. They were flash vaporized, turned instantly from solid matter into an expanding cloud of superheated plasma. The thermal flash was so intense, it overloaded the optical sensors on the Vanguard for 3 full seconds. Valen turned back to the screen, expecting to see the human captain pale and trembling, finally broken by the realization of his own insignificance. Instead, the visual feed cleared to show Silas Thorne leaning forward, his eyes narrowed in intense professional scrutiny. His officers in the background weren't screaming. They were rapidly typing on their keyboards. "Holy hell," Thorne murmured. He didn't sound scared. He sounded impressed. He looked over his shoulder. "Lieutenant, did you get the telemetry on that?" "Yes, Captain," a voice called out from off-screen. "Energy spike was off the charts. Looks like a focused particle stream. Speed was near luminal." Thorne turned his attention back to Valen. The lopsided smile was gone, replaced by a look of deep analytical respect. That is a hell of a gun you've got there, Commander. The thermal displacement alone is staggering. How do you manage the heatsink issues without melting your own firing arrays? We've been trying to solve that problem in our railgun labs for a decade. Valen stood frozen. You are insane, Valen whispered. I just showed you the weapon that will turn your ship into dust, and you ask me how it works. Thorne sat back, crossing his arms over his chest. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were hard. The eyes of a warrior who had drawn a line in the sand. I understand the threat, Commander. It's loud and it's clear, and your guns are beautiful. But here is the thing you need to understand about us. Thorne leaned forward again, the low light of the bridge catching the silver in his hair. You aren't the first people to tell us we can't go somewhere. My grandfather was told he couldn't cross an ocean. He did it anyway. My father was told he couldn't break the atmosphere. He did it anyway. We were told the moon was unreachable. We walked on it. We were told the stars were too far, the math was too hard, the physics were impossible. But we're sitting here, aren't we? Thorne's voice didn't rise in volume, but the gravity in it seemed to increase tenfold. We went to the moon on guts, Commander. Not logic. Every time someone tells a human being that a door is closed, we don't walk away. We kick it off its hinges. Threatening us doesn't make us turn around. It just makes us stubborn. Valen stared at the screen. He had commanded armies. He had overseen the subjugation of star systems. But he had never in his long life encountered a psychology quite like this. It defied all known logic of self-preservation. It was reckless. It was arrogant. It was dangerously magnificent. Your ship is a flying coffin, Captain Thorne, Valen said quietly. You have a crew of perhaps 50. I have a garrison of 300. I can summon an armada that will blot out your sun. Do you truly comprehend the scale of the power you are defying? I do, Thorne replied, his voice equally quiet, completely devoid of bravado. And I respect it. But Earth is home to billions of people. We've survived world wars. We've survived famine. We've stared extinction in the face more times than I care to count. And we are still here. We aren't going to turn our tails and run just because the neighbor has a bigger stick. We are passing through. We will not fire first, but we will not turn back. A tense, heavy silence fell over the communication channel. Two commanders separated by millions of years of evolution, locked in a battle of wills. Before Valen could make a decision, the crystalline communications officer gasped a sound like shattering glass. Commander, multiple hyperspace ruptures detected Sector Grid 9. Valen tore his eyes from the human and looked at the tactical display. Space itself was tearing open. Red icons flooded the screen, spawning rapidly from the tears in reality. 7 heavy cruisers dropped into real space, their engines burning with a sickly corrupted green light. Their hulls were a jagged, asymmetrical mess of scavenged armor and stolen weaponry. They flew without formation, driven only by bloodlust and greed. The Vorath Valen breathed his blood, running cold. They were the plague of the Outer Rim. Pirates, scavengers, butchers. A species that the Dominion had hunted for centuries, but could never fully exterminate. They struck without warning, targeting isolated outposts, slaughtering the defenders, and taking everything of value. And they had caught Valen's station with its main defensive cannons cooling down from the asteroid demonstration. Battle stations, Valen roared. Divert all power to the primary shields. Warm up the secondary batteries. Send a distress signal to Fleet Command immediately. The station descended into chaos. The crimson lights flashed faster. The heavy blast doors slammed shut. Valen's crew, disciplined, but suddenly faced with a nightmare scenario, scrambled to their posts. On the visual feed, Silas Thorne was already barking orders to his own crew. The casual demeanor had evaporated instantly, replaced by the razor-sharp focus of a combat veteran. Valen activated the channel to the human ship. Captain Thorne, this is not your fight. The Vorath do not take prisoners. Your vessel is completely unequipped for this combat scenario. Turn your ship around and engage your primitive warp drive while you still can. Run! Thorne turned to look at the screen, the tactical display reflected in his eyes. Negative, Commander Thorne said, his voice clipped and hard. My sensors are reading life signs on your station. Non-combatants. I'm reading the metabolic rates. You have children on board. Valen paused. We have 62 juveniles, yes, But that is irrelevant to you. You cannot save them. Your ship will be destroyed in the first volley. Flee, human. Thorn reached out and gripped the edge of his console. He didn't look at Valen. He looked past the camera out into the void where the pirate fleet was accelerating toward the station. In that fraction of a second, Silas Thorn made a choice. It was not a choice born of logic. It was not a choice born of tactical advantage. It was a choice born of a fundamental, unshakable human truth. You do not abandon the weak to the wolves. Lieutenant Thorn's voice rang out across the bridge of the Vanguard. Cut the main drive. Bring us around. Put this ship directly between the station and the incoming fleet. Captain, a younger voice responded, tight with fear, but steady with discipline. We don't have energy shields. If we take a direct hit from plasma... I know what will happen, son, Thorn interrupted gently but firmly. Bring us around. Warm up the railguns. Load the depleted uranium slugs. We're going to show these bastards how the United States Navy fights. Valen watched in absolute disbelief as a small, blocky human ship fired its chemical thrusters. It did not turn away. It executed a hard, punishing burn, sliding through the vacuum of space until it sat dead center in the firing lane between the pirate armada and the station's civilian quarters. It was a shield of solid iron, a speed bump in the path of a hurricane. Thorn, you are committing suicide, Valen shouted over the comms. Your weapons will not penetrate their energy shields. You have no defenses. Silas Thorn looked back at the screen one last time. The lopsided smile returned grim and resolute. Commander, where I come from, we have a saying. It's not the size of the dog in the fight. It's the size of the fight in the dog. Thorn reached up and severed the communication link. The screen went black. Outside, in the cold, silent expanse of space, the United States Space Command vessel Vanguard locked its primitive targeting sensors on the leading Vorath cruiser. Deep within the belly of the ship, the nuclear reactor howled, pushing power to the magnetic rails of the main cannons. The pirates, arrogant and hungry for blood, saw the tiny metal ship in their path and did not even bother to change course. The Vorath warlord, watching from his command throne, laughed a guttural, wet sound. He ordered his Vanguard to fire a single plasma volley to sweep the trash from their path before they feasted on the station. Bolts of superheated green plasma tore across the void, illuminating the dark. They struck the Vanguard. Valen braced himself, expecting the human ship to instantly vaporize. The plasma splashed against the Vanguard's hull. The thermal bloom was massive. But when the light faded, the ship was still there. The Vorath did not understand. Valen did not understand. They were accustomed to energy shields. They fired weapons designed to overload magnetic fields and short-circuit energy grids. But the Vanguard had no energy shields to overload. It possessed only cold, dense mass. 3 meters of interlocking titanium tungsten armor plate, designed to withstand the brutal friction of atmospheric re-entry and the microscopic debris of dead space. The plasma scorched the metal. It melted the outer layers, but it did not punch through. The Vanguard shuddered, but it held the line. Then the human ship fired back. There were no bright flashes of laser light. There were no glowing orbs of plasma. There was only the silent, violent recoil of physical mass being accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light by electromagnetic force. A slug of solid, depleted uranium weighing 200 pounds crossed the distance between the ships in the blink of an eye. Energy shields are designed to dissipate heat and deflect light. They are incredibly complex algorithms of force, but they are entirely unprepared for the dumb, brutal physics of a rock thrown really, really fast. The uranium slug struck the energy shield of the lead Vorath cruiser. The shield flashed white, trying to absorb the kinetic energy. It failed instantly. The shield shattered like glass. The slug tore through the pirate ship's hull from bow to stern, ripping through bulkheads, atmospheric containment, and finally the engine core. The Vorath cruiser detonated from the inside out, expanding into a silent, beautiful sphere of orange flame. Silence descended on the tactical channel. On the bridge of the Dominion station, Commander Valen stared at the expanding wreckage of a warship that had terrified his boarders for a decade, destroyed by a single shot from a ship that shouldn't have been able to dent its paint. On the bridge of the Vanguard, Captain Silas Thorn wiped a drop of sweat from his forehead. He stared at the remaining 6 pirate ships, which were now scattering in sudden, panicked confusion. Target the next one, Thorn said quietly. Keep them away from the station. The fight had begun, and the galaxy was about to learn that while humanity might carry primitive weapons, they possessed a will of absolute iron. Aboard the Vorath flagship, Warlord Kalok stared at the optical feed in stunned, absolute disbelief. Kalok was a creature bred in the dark fringes of the galaxy, a hulking mass of scarred muscle and predatory instincts. He had butchered Dominion outposts. He had glassed planetary colonies. He had never seen a vessel completely ignore a plasma strike only to punch a hole straight through a warship with a piece of flying rock. The arrogance in Kalok's dark eyes dissolved into the cold, calculating fury of a wounded predator. "Concentrate fire!" Kalok roared, his voice a guttural scrape of rage across his bridge. "Forget the station. Tear that primitive metal box to pieces. Burn them out." The 6 remaining Vorath cruisers broke their loose formation. They swarmed like angry hornets, surrounding the Vanguard in a chaotic three-dimensional sphere of attack. Aboard the Vanguard, the reality of the situation was written in the flashing red emergency lights and the frantic shouted reports of the bridge crew. "Incoming thermal spikes. Multiple vectors," the tactical officer yelled. His hands flew across the physical keyboards. "They're locking on." Captain Silas Thorne stood at the center of the bridge. He watched the tactical plot. The Vanguard was not an agile ship. It was built with the architectural philosophy of a submarine. It moved heavily, fighting the laws of physics with stubborn, brute force. "Evasive pattern Delta," Thorne commanded, his voice a steady rumble. "Keep our bow facing their heaviest concentration. Make them chew through the thickest part of the plate. Fire railguns 2 and 4 at will. Keep them guessing." The Vanguard lurched. The massive chemical thrusters fired in rapid succession, groaning against the ship's own immense mass. Green plasma bolts rained down upon them. They struck the armor with the force of localized suns. The sound inside the hull was terrifying, a continuous deafening roar of metal screaming under extreme thermal stress. The temperature on the bridge spiked 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. Paint blistered on the bulkheads. But the armor held. The Vanguard returned fire. 2 more solid uranium slugs lashed out into the dark. They missed their primary targets as the agile Vorath ships violently adjusted their vectors, but the sheer kinetic wake of the rounds passing close by was enough to spin one of the pirate cruisers out of control. Warlord Kalok watched the human ship weather the storm. His fury began to curdle into dread. This ship was absorbing punishment that would have melted a Dominion frigate. If he committed his remaining ships to a close-range brawl, he would lose them. The metal monster would break their teeth. Kalok slammed his heavy fist onto his command console. "Pull back to maximum range," he ordered his fleet. "Activate the deep space beacon. Call the Blood Fleet." His helmsman hesitated. "Warlord, the Blood Fleet is held in reserve. If we summon the dreadnoughts for a single outpost." "Call them," Kalok bellowed. "I want this metal ship ground into dust." A high-frequency subspace pulse shot out from the Vorath flagship, tearing through the fabric of real space. On the bridge of the Vanguard, the sensors immediately caught the anomaly. "Captain," the sensor operator's voice cracked. "I'm reading massive subspace ruptures. Deep space coordinates just outside the system edge. They aren't cruisers, sir. The mass signatures, they're capital ships. Dreadnoughts." Thorne stepped closer to the tactical display. "How many? 12. 12 capital ships. They'll be on top of us in exactly 10 minutes. The bridge went dead silent. The grinding of the engines, the wailing of the alarms, all of it seemed to fade into a hollow vacuum. Against 6 light cruisers, the Vanguard was a fortress. Against 12 capital ships armed with heavy planetary siege weapons, the Vanguard was a tin can. Thorne looked at the countdown timer on the main screen. 9:59, 9:58. Beside Thorne's command chair, the ceramic mug of black coffee rested on a metal lip. The Vanguard took another glancing hit of plasma. The deck plates vibrated with a deep structural groan. The ceramic mug edged forward. It tipped. It hit the grated metal floor and shattered into a dozen jagged pieces, the dark liquid pooling around Thorne's boots. It was a small thing, but in that moment it signaled the end of the illusion. The safety of the hull was a lie. They were going to die here light years from home in a patch of empty space that didn't even have a name. Thorne looked down at the shattered mug. He took a slow, deep breath, pulling the scent of ozone and burning wiring deep into his lungs. When he looked back up, his eyes were clear, cold, resolved. 10 minutes is a lifetime, Thorne said. The calmness in his voice anchored the terrified crew. Keep firing, we don't give them an inch. But Kalok had changed his tactics. The Vorath warlord realized that the human ship was focused on defending itself. But the human ship was not the objective. Target the Dominion station, Kalok ordered with a cruel smile. Target the lower habitat ring. Let's see what the metal men do when we aim at the weak. On the Vanguard sensors, the power spike on the Vorath flagship was unmistakable. Sir, the tactical officer shouted, the lead cruiser is ignoring us. They're locking their main battery onto the station. Grid Sector 4, Thorne's mind raced. Grid Sector 4, that's the civilian habitat, Thorne said. That's where the children are. They're firing a beam of concentrated superheated plasma twice the size of anything the Vorath had fired so far erupted from the pirate flagship. It bypassed the Vanguard arcing perfectly toward the fragile towers of the Dominion border station. That beam would slice through the habitat ring like a hot knife through wax. Thousands would die instantly. Thorne did not calculate the odds. He did not consult a tactical manual. He acted on the instinct that had defined the American military tradition since its inception. You protect the people behind you, no matter the cost. Hardport, Thorne roared. Emergency thrust. Put us in the beam, Captain. The armor is already compromised on that side. Do it! The Vanguard's massive thrusters screamed. The heavy ship threw itself sideways, a desperate lunge across the void. It slid into the path of the beam just a fraction of a second before it struck the station. The impact was catastrophic. This was a sustained, concentrated beam hitting directly amidships. The titanium tungsten plates did not hold. They glowed cherry red, then blinding white, and then they turned to liquid. The beam punched through the outer hull, tearing into the fragile internal structure of the ship. On the bridge, the crew was thrown to the deck as the artificial gravity momentarily failed. Sparks showered from the ceiling. The sound of the impact was a deafening physical blow that ruptured eardrums. Report, Thorne yelled, pulling himself up, wiping a streak of blood from his forehead. The damage control officer's voice was pure panic. Direct hit on decks 3 and 4 hull breach. We have a massive hull breach. Vacuum exposure in sections C through F seal, the bulkheads. They're buckled, sir. The automated doors are jammed. Thorne's heart slammed against his ribs. Decks 3 and 4. That was engineering support. The crew mess, override manually. Get those people out of there. I'm trying. I'm losing telemetry. The officer looked up, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. Captain, we lost them. Decks 3 and 4 are gone. Atmosphere is vented to space. Thorne closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. 24 American sailors, gone in the blink of an eye, turned to ice in memory in the cold dark. But Thorne could not mourn them. Not yet. The clock was still ticking. 7:14. Main drive is offline, the helmsman reported, his voice shaking. Reactor is unstable. Core temperature is rising. We are dead in the water, Captain. The Vanguard drifted, a wounded, bleeding beast, smoking and venting gas into the void. It had taken the hit. It had saved the station. But its back was broken. On the Dominion station, Commander Valen watched the optical feed in stunned silence. He watched the debris from the human ship float outward. He activated the secure channel. Captain Thorne, Valen said. His voice was no longer a command. It was a eulogy. Your ship is crippled. You have done more than honor demands. The Vorath dreadnoughts will be here in less than 6 minutes. You must launch your escape pods. Save yourselves. Thorne's voice came back through the static. We aren't going anywhere, Commander. You are a fool. Valen shouted, his stoicism cracking. You cannot fight 12 capital ships with a dead engine. Your defiance is meaningless now. You are bleeding to death. I know, Thorne said quietly. On the bridge of the Vanguard, Thorne looked at the tactical map. The countdown timer read 5:42. The 12 Vorath dreadnoughts were coming in fast through hyperspace. They were using a standardized jump corridor. They would all emerge in exactly the same coordinate space in a tight, concentrated formation. Thorne looked at the reactor core telemetry. The core was running hot, uncontrollably hot. An idea formed in Thorne's mind. It was not a tactical maneuver. It was an act of pure calculated madness. Commander Valen, Thorne said into the comms, Those dreadnoughts are jumping into grid sector 9, correct? Yes, Valen replied. They will emerge from hyperspace in that exact location. And if something were sitting in that exact location when they arrived, something with a destabilized nuclear fission core pushed to a critical mass overload. There was a long silence from the Dominion commander. A nuclear explosion in the vacuum of space has limited kinetic range, Valen finally said. But if it occurred precisely at the moment of their translation from hyperspace to real space, the thermal shockwave would catch their shields while they are down. It would cause a catastrophic chain reaction in their own hyperdrives. It would tear their fleet to atoms. But your ship has no engines. You cannot maneuver to the jump point. We don't have main thrust, Thorne said, looking at his helmsman. What about the maneuvering thrusters? They're intact, sir, the helmsman said, but they barely have enough delta to move our mass. It would take every drop of fuel we have left to push us to that grid sector. How long to get us there? 4 minutes. Thorne looked at the main countdown timer. 4:50. It was enough. Do it, Thorne said. Push this heavy bitch to grid sector 9. Captain Valen's voice crackled. If you overload your reactor, you will have no power for your escape pods. They require the ship's internal catapult system to launch clear of the blast radius. You cannot do both, Thorne knew. Once the reactor sequence started, the Vanguard would lose all internal power. If the main pods weren't fired out of the catapult tubes before the power died, the crew would be trapped inside the hull when the reactor went critical. But if they launched the pods now, the Vanguard would have no automated systems left to make the precise navigational burns required to hit the jump point. Someone had to steer the ship manually. Thorne reached over to the comms panel and activated the ship-wide public address system. Attention all hands. This is the captain. The ship went still. Even the groaning of the metal seemed to quiet down to listen. We have taken heavy damage. We have lost decks 3 and 4. We have lost good people. In 4 minutes, a fleet of 12 pirate dreadnoughts is going to drop into our sector. If they get past us, they are going to slaughter the 300 civilians on that station. 62 of them are kids. I don't care if they are a different species. They are innocent and they are defenseless. Thorne gripped the back of the command chair. His knuckles were white. I am ordering an immediate mandatory evacuation of this vessel. Get to the escape pods. All of you, you will launch in exactly 3 minutes. The main pods must go now before we lose power. The young helmsman turned around, his eyes wide. Captain, the ship, the automated navigation is dead. Someone has to steer us into the jump point. I know, Thorne said into the PA system. I need a skeleton crew to stay on the bridge with me, to manually hold the thruster controls and override the reactor safeties after the power cuts out. Thorne paused, the weight of his next words heavy on his tongue. He had to be completely honest with them. We will not be using the main pods, but there is a manual override for the bridge command module. It is a relic. Mid-20th century tech built for the Apollo days and retrofitted for this hull. It relies entirely on chemical explosive bolts to separate this room from the rest of the ship. It does not need main power. Thorne looked down at the deck, his voice turning grim and steady. I will not lie to you. It is not a safe ticket home. It was designed for deep space failure, not combat. It pulls 50 Gs of raw, unfiltered acceleration. It has never been tested inside the thermal radius of a nuclear blast. The engineers back in Houston gave it a 1% survival rating. It will likely crush our chests and rupture our lungs before the shockwave even hits us. It is a coin flip in the dark, and the coin is rigged against us. He raised his head. His eyes burned with a fierce, terrible pride. I am not asking you to die, but I am asking you to walk into the fire with me. Someone has to make sure this ship gets to where it needs to be. Someone has to make sure those kids get to wake up tomorrow. We are the United States Space Command. We are the shield in the dark. That is what makes us who we are. Who's with me? Before the echo of his voice even faded, the young helmsman, Vance, locked his restraints into the pilot's chair. Course laid in, Captain. The kid set his hands steady on the yoke. Maneuvering thrusters are green. Behind him, the chief engineer stepped forward, picking up a heavy physical wrench. I can bypass the physical safeties on the reactor from here, sir. The communications officer, Miller, didn't say a word. She just tightened her bandage and locked her console. Thorne swallowed hard. Get the rest of the crew to the pods, Thorne ordered his chief. Just us on the bridge. That's an order. 2 minutes and 58 seconds. Across the soot-stained outer plating of the ship, heavy blast doors snapped open. One by one, spherical escape pods were violently ejected into the cold vacuum of space. They shot away from the dying warship, leaving trails of white exhaust in the dark. 26 men and women. The survivors. On the bridge, the emergency red lighting flickered, sparked and stood. The ship plunged into absolute darkness. For 3 seconds, there was only the sound of heavy breathing. Then a harsh, terrifying glow began to seep up through the grated metal floor. A sickly, deep cerulean blue. Main power is gone, the chief said. The reactor is in runaway. Coolant lines are severed. She's eating herself, Captain. We are officially sitting on top of an unchained sun. The temperature on the bridge rose exponentially. It was a physical assault. The air turned heavy, tasting of copper and melted plastic. Sweat beaded on Thorne's forehead and instantly evaporated. Grid Sector 9, Vance gasped, his hands blistered from gripping the control yoke. We are in position, Captain. Dead center of the jump corridor terminus. We are parked right on the X. Good flying, son. Lock the thrusters. We aren't moving from this spot. Thorne reached beneath his command panel, his fingers brushing against a heavy glass-covered switch painted industrial yellow. The manual override for the explosive bolts. Strap in, Thorne ordered. That is an order. The 3 crew members scrambled into their heavy G-force seats, pulling the thick canvas straps over their chests and locking the steel buckles into place. Thorne locked his harness. 30 seconds. The deep blue light rising from the floor turned into a blinding, savage violet. The deck vibrated as the fundamental structure of atoms broke apart beneath their feet. The metal walls groaned, warping from the intense internal heat. They're coming, Miller whispered, staring out the shattered forward viewport. Space itself began to tear. The starlight warped and stretched, pulling into long, impossible streaks of color. The fabric of reality groaned under the immense gravitational stress. 15 seconds. Hold on to something, Thorne said quietly. 10. The ripples in space turned into violent, jagged tears. 5. The first Varath dreadnought breached the threshold of real space. It was a leviathan, a nightmare of jagged steel bristling with heavy planetary bombardment cannons. It emerged from the slipstream with the arrogance of an apex predator. 4. 3 more dreadnoughts broke through the tear in space, sliding into perfect formation. 3. The remaining 8 capital ships flooded into Sector Grid 9, their weapons already powering up to annihilate the Dominion station. 2. The Vorath warlord on the lead dreadnought looked at his optical sensors. For a fraction of a millisecond, his brain registered an anomaly. There was a piece of debris directly in their path, a blackened dead piece of primitive metal. 1. Silas Thorne smashed his fist through the glass cover and pulled the heavy yellow lever. 0. A ring of explosive bolts detonated simultaneously around the circumference of the Vanguard's bridge module. The shaped charges severed the thick titanium struts, physically decapitating the ship. The concussive force slammed Thorne and his crew back into their seats with bone-crushing violence. The bridge module, a tiny armored pill, was blasted away from the main hull at 50 Gs of acceleration. Air was driven from Thorne's lungs in a violent rush. His vision narrowed to a pinprick. He felt ribs crack under the heavy canvas straps. The physical trauma of the archaic launch system was absolute agony. A microsecond later, the Vanguard's nuclear core reached critical mass. There was no sound. There was only light. A sphere of pure, unadulterated white atomic fire was born in the darkness. It was a localized sun, a brief, terrifying star created by human hands. The Varath dreadnoughts had no time to raise their heavy siege shields. They had dropped out of hyperspace blind and arrogant directly into the mouth of a thermonuclear furnace. The lead dreadnought simply ceased to exist. Its thick, scavenged armor flashed into vapor in a millionth of a second. The extreme thermal shockwave ignited the pirate ship's own volatile energy cores, turning the vessel into a secondary bomb. The explosion chained outward. The massive gravitational forces of the dreadnought's hyperdrives, caught mid-cycle in the atomic blast, collapsed in on themselves. Reality fractured. The resulting spatial distortion tore the remaining capital ships to shreds. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The command module of the Vanguard, rocketing away from the epicenter, was caught by the very edge of the expanding shockwave. Inside the tiny capsule, the world turned into a chaotic centrifuge. The module spun wildly, tumbling end over end, cast out into the dark like a stone, skipping across a violent ocean. Then everything went black. When Silas Thorne opened his eyes, his head was throbbing. His mouth tasted of iron and salt. The emergency battery of the command module bathed the cramped space in a faint, sickly green glow. He looked to his left. Vance was slumped in his harness, breathing shallowly, his eyes closed. Miller was awake, staring blankly at the dark viewport. The chief was groaning, clutching his chest, a fresh line of blood running down his chin. The 1% chance had held. They were alive. Thorne unbuckled his harness. Gravity was gone. He floated upward, grabbing the edge of the console. He wiped a layer of condensation from the thick glass and peered out into the void. The stars were obscured by a massive, expanding nebula of glowing superheated gas. Millions of tons of alien alloy reduced to stardust. Through the haze, Thorne could see the faint crystalline lights of the Dominion border station. It was battered. Its shields were completely gone. But it was whole. It was safe. We got him, Thorne whispered. 47 minutes. That was the time the Dominion Fleet Command had estimated for reinforcements to arrive. They arrived precisely on schedule. 30 pristine, majestic Dominion cruisers dropped out of hyperspace. They had come expecting ashes. Instead, they found a silent, empty void choked with the vaporized remains of an enemy armada that defied comprehension. Aboard the border station, Commander Valen stood on his command deck. The station's tractor beams were slowly, carefully pulling a series of charred, primitive metal spheres into the main hangar bay. Commander, the communications officer said softly, "The fleet admiral is demanding a sitrep. He is asking what weapon we deployed to cause this level of destruction. Tell the Admiral," Valen said, his voice a low rumble, "that we deployed nothing. Tell him that we were saved by ghosts." The main hangar bay of the Dominion station was a cathedral of light and glass. Today it was a triage center for beings that smelled of sweat, ozone, and spent gunpowder. The American escape pods sat heavily on the pristine deck, their metal hulls scorched and indented. Dominion medical teams moved among the human survivors. The humans did not celebrate. They sat together in small clusters, their faces dark with soot, their eyes hollow with the memory of the 24 empty bunks they had left behind. At the far end of the hangar, a heavy tractor beam gently lowered the final piece of debris onto the deck. It was the decapitated bridge module of the Vanguard. It looked like a crushed soda can, blackened by atomic fire, its edges jagged and torn. The heavy pneumatic seal of the module's door hissed. The locking mechanisms ground against warped metal. With a violent kick from the inside, the door blew outward, clattering onto the crystalline floor. Captain Silas Thorne stepped out. His blue uniform was torn and stained black. He favored his left leg, limping slightly as he stepped down from the wreckage. Behind him, Vance Miller and the chief emerged battered, bruised, holding broken ribs but breathing. Thorne looked around the massive hangar. He counted them in his head. 26 from the pods, 4 from the bridge, 30 souls. 30 out of 54, the cost of holding the line. A heavy rhythmic thud echoed across the hangar bay. The human crew went silent. The Dominion medical personnel stepped back, parting like a sea to make way. Commander Valen was walking toward them. He was a terrifying sight, an apex predator engineered for command. He was flanked by a dozen heavily armed Imperial guards. Valen stopped 10 paces from Silas Thorne. The giant alien looked down at the human. He looked at the primitive, torn clothing. He looked at a creature that by all the laws of the galaxy should have been completely insignificant. Valen's 4 eyes locked onto Thorne's too. Then the commander of the Galactic Dominion Border Defense did something that sent a shockwave of absolute disbelief through every alien soldier in the room. He stepped back, placed his heavy fist over his primary heart, and bowed. He bent his massive frame at the waist, lowering his head until his eyes were level with the human's chest. It was a bow reserved only for emperors and warriors who had pulled victory from the jaws of certain death. Captain Silas Thorne. Valen's voice echoed through the hangar, stripped of all arrogance. You stood in the dark. You shielded the innocent. You paid a price in blood that was not yours to pay. On behalf of the Galactic Dominion, on behalf of the 62 children who will sleep safely tonight, I offer you my life, my honor, and the eternal gratitude of 10,000 worlds. Thorne stood straight. The exhaustion in his bones was a physical weight, but he met the alien's gaze with the quiet dignity of a man who had done his job. "You don't owe us your life," Commander Thorne said, his voice a rough rasp. "We just did what had to be done." Valen shook his head slowly. "No, any sane creature would have fled. What you did defies reason." "Reason doesn't keep you warm at night," Commander Thorne replied softly. "Knowing you didn't leave anyone behind does." Thorne reached a trembling hand into the deep pocket of his torn survival jacket. He pulled out a small, crinkled foil packet. It was a single-serve ration of instant black coffee. It had survived the battle, survived the radiation, and survived the crash. Thorne took a limping step forward and held the packet out to the giant alien commander. "I believe," Thorne said, a faint, exhausted ghost of a smile touching his lips, "that I owed you a cup of coffee." Valen looked at the tiny silver packet in the palm of the human's hand. He did not know the ritual, but he understood the gravity of the gesture. He reached out with a massive armored three-fingered hand. With exquisite gentleness, he took the small packet from Thorne. "I will treasure it, Captain Thorne," Valen said solemnly. Over the next few hours, the story of the human ship Vanguard spread through the Dominion fleet. It was spoken in hushed, reverent tones in the military academies of species that had waged war for millennia. A single primitive vessel of iron and fire, a crew of frail bipeds who refused to run, a captain who sacrificed his own ship, his own people to save the children of strangers. Fleet Admiral Torren of the Dominion High Command did not issue sanctions for the Vanguard's violation of sovereign space. He did not demand reparations. Instead, he signed an immediate unconditional decree. The human race was granted unrestricted, honorary citizenship across the entirety of the galactic dominion. They were granted safe passage through every star system and every border outpost. But more importantly, they were granted a reputation. The galaxy is a dark, cold, and unforgiving place. It is filled with ancient terrors and apex predators that lurk in the deep void. For millions of years, the rule of the stars was simple: the strong survive and the weak perish. But on that day, the math of the universe changed. A new truth was written in the radioactive ash of a dead pirate fleet, a truth that would echo across the 10,000 worlds for generations to come. It is a simple promise forged in the iron of a shattered hull and paid for with the blood of 24 American sailors. If you are weak, if you are cornered, if the dark is closing in and you have nowhere left to run, call out. Call out into the void and hold the line. Because out there in the deep black, the humans are listening. They might be flying ships made of primitive metal. They might be armed with weapons of brute force. They might be stubborn, arrogant, and entirely too fond of caffeine. But when you call for help in the dark, humans will come. Always.